I got fired at Uber for pissing off my boss one day. And so certainly if you like read my resume, right, like you don't pick that up because like I don't emphasize that. I'm not embarrassed of it.
All right, so I'm here today with Will Larson. You might know Will from the Staff Engineer Handbook, from his blog, which I know a lot of people read, or just from his general presence in the tech industry, which is not that big of an industry. I first heard of Will long before I met him. I guess I still technically am in the CTO group, Will, that you run. I get a lot out of it, even though I haven't shown up in a while. But yeah, Will runs these learning groups that I think all of us involved really appreciate, and all of us have learned a lot about engineering leadership, technical leadership, and all that. So I thought it would be great to get Will on this podcast and just talk about, all of his wisdom and advice. So Will, let's start by telling everyone a little bit about your background. Who are you? How did you get here?
No, amazing. And I think Gene has an interesting background as the first person with a duplicate name in the CTO group that we were running. So a group with two Genes, but no other duplicate names yet. So
yeah, it's pretty crazy.
It's not the name I would have guessed.
We have two Davids on this podcast, and that's pretty normal. But I've never been even on a podcast with two Genes.
Well, you'll figure out how to make it happen. I'm sure Gene would be glad to join. So I'm Will. My path, I don't know how I got here in most ways, but grew up in North Carolina, went to school in Kentucky for computer science, taught English in Japan. Somehow ended up at Yahoo in 2009, which was, a Yahoo of I think 6 layoffs over the course of 2 years that I was there. It's pretty wild out here in 2024, but certainly, 2009 was equally wild. It's just easy to forget at this point. But from there, it really had a pretty from run. Went to Dig, then from Dig to Uber. Uber ended up at Stripe. And then went from Stripe to be the CTO at Com. And then a little bit under a year ago, I got to join Carta to lead their engineering and data science teams. So it's been, I think getting to see a lot of the industry. As you said, a small industry. So definitely been fun to be part of it.
Yeah, so I feel like your career path is the dream career path for a lot of people looking to have more impact or, make their mark on the industry. So I'm curious how you got into engineering leadership and, how did you progress?
First, I think career paths are curated things. My career path's not that real. It's a thing that's been constructed on LinkedIn to represent this perfect sequencing. I think there's lots of things that happened throughout that career path that were not exactly to plan. I got fired at Uber for pissing off my boss one day, and so certainly if you read my resume, right, you don't pick that up because I don't emphasize that. I'm not embarrassed of it, but it's something that happened. And so I just think first, it's easy to overthink people's career paths as these amazing things they did and this perfect crafted thing. But all career paths are kind of sewn together. They're not actually what they look like. But the biggest thing for me has always been finding interesting work that stretches me, while also writing a lot. And I think the intersection of those two things has been incredibly powerful and has really got to me to where I am today. I think if I'd done only one or the other, wouldn't have been able to get the opportunities that I've gotten.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Will. And how would you describe your current job? I feel like we have several CEOs on this podcast. Several CEOs and CTOs on this podcast, and everyone's job is very different.
Yeah, so I've been the CTO twice, a CTO at Com. When I joined Com, it was 25 engineers. When I left, it was about 100. And so CTO at Carta, it's about 400 engineers. And so those are same titles, right? But radically different actual day-to-day work. I think at Com, spent a lot of time thinking about what the products are, what the next products are, platform leverage, how do we make it faster to actually deliver? I spend like a lot less time at that level of granularity. Like I do spend a little bit of time at Carta on like how do the platforms work, etc. But actually, like even more of my time at Carta has been about like focusing the energy. And so, for example, when I joined, I worked with the team, Dan Fike, Shauna, like a bunch of folks on the engineering team to figure out like what our strategy should be. And a lot of that was just like narrowing, where it's like we're not going to do any more services, we're not going to do any more platforms, and it's actually just been like cutting down on places we put our energy. Because I do think that's been the biggest focus for me the first 6 months was just reduction. Like let's only put energy in things that we have conviction on and that really align with what matters to the company right now. And again, this is where you look at like 2017 and, a great leader in 2017 was about placing like 17 bets and like one of them would sprout and you're a good leader. I think leadership in 2023 or 2024 is like really focusing down to the essentials and making sure those things succeed. Because you don't have 17 bets you're allowed to make. You're allowed to make like one, and if it fails, like you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I feel like Ben Horowitz, I think, has written about wartime leaders versus peacetime leaders, but there's also leaders for times of abundance and leadership for times of scarcity, and we're definitely in a scarcity period.
Yeah, 100%. And this is like where you see people come from like a Google or a Facebook and go into like a startup and just like really, really mess the company up because they just try to like do too many things.
You're not in abundance anymore.
It's like, well, can't we just hire, like get more headcount? And it's like, this is it. It's like, there's no more money. Like that's it. It's like a real shift.
Yeah. No, I'd love to come back to this point later if we have time. But for now, I'd be really curious to just get some of, Will Larson's basics on teams and companies. And like, as we mentioned, it might be different for times of abundance versus times of scarcity. But at this point, you've been at companies of many stages and you've been involved in building lots of teams. I'd love to get a sense of like overarching principles. Like you've personally given me a lot of advice on like, in this situation, like this is how to think about the team. But, do you have like general approaches to hiring and building teams you would use for all situations, and then we can dig into different times require different situations.
So the really like stereotypical advice to give to like all questions as a leader is like that it depends, right?
Yeah.
My sort of like counter stereotype is like, I think my advice is like almost anything you do is fine as long as you're consistent about doing it. So for example, if you have 8-person teams and only 8-person teams, that's fine. But if you like enforce 8-person teams some places and then let some other people do 2-person teams, like that creates a ton of confusion. Yeah. So my new kind of theory of leadership is just like anything you do, as long as you do it consistently, even if it's bad, people that you work with are smart and they'll like figure out how to like work around it.
Yeah. No, I think consistency is really underrated in leadership and team building.
And it's like pretty easy because you can be like, actually, I'm not very good at this, but like I can just be like bad in the same way every time, and people will actually like make it work.
People learn to adjust.
You.
If you're bad in a different way every time, like people are totally blindsided.
And there's people who don't mind like a certain type of badness. Like if
and they can
if you're overly blunt,
yeah.
they can like be like, okay, like Will's too blunt, or like Jean's too blunt. She's like mean to me all the time, but like I'm used to it. Versus like if you're unpredictable, like they can't self-select. To your point,
I just watched Mean Girls, and I think there's a line like I just learned to accept like anger is her love language. Once you accept it. You can deal with it. But yeah, that's really a point. I actually never thought about consistency as being the thing before.
Yeah, and to your point, like people will follow you from company to company once they figure out like what's wrong with you.
Yeah,
but they know like what's wrong with you, and so they can like okay, I know how to work with this guy. Even though he's not perfect, because like none of us are perfect.
Yeah,
right?
people do like predictability of their environments. Yeah, because I feel like usually the advice is like do X and be consistent about it. And I like how your advice is just be consistent about whatever X you do. X can be whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's like the easiest advice and the best advice I can give is like just be consistent. But obviously, like in terms of like hiring and building teams, there's like lots of like more nuanced advice that you can give folks. But I think Consistency, for me, a big one. And my love of consistency comes from my like hatred of my managers who are inconsistent, because like I'm someone who like spends a lot of time optimizing. And then if they change something, like all my optimizations now look dumb. Like I've just like wasted a bunch of time. But so to me, it's like figure out like who your leaders are, like figure out like how to put them in a position where they know what's expected of them, and just be consistent about that. Something I have thought about a lot though is when are the times that you really drill in and get into the details? Because one problem with kind of picking the leaders and being consistent is that if you do that wrong, that's just like kind of hands off, like it's like abdication.
Yeah.
It's don't know what they're doing on infrastructure, but probably it's
consistently
fine.
Not know.
Yeah. I'll never know.
I just never know. Okay. Yeah. If you ask me on any day, I don't know.
And that's like not great either. So I do think there's like, to your point about kind of peacetime, wartime, there are moments when like something's going wrong and you do have to shift style a little bit. And again, I think it's just like, it's okay to like, there's this idea that micromanagement's like really, really bad. But when things are going wrong, like micromanagement's your only tool to actually get in and understand like what's going wrong, why it's going wrong, and how to help. And so like, I actually don't think micromanagement is bad. Consistently, it's a good tool.
I also feel like when there are quality issues, or like when you get into like what I call a remedial state, sometimes like getting really in the weeds, like giving like very detailed run books and like showing people that like you care about the details is the way to kind of kickstart things into a better situation.
To your earlier point about like giving generic advice to folks, I think the problem is if you don't micromanage sometimes, you give them like generic. It's like the reason like we're not a reliable company is that you need to write software that thinks about failure modes. You're like, well, you're like, what is that like? What does that even mean? Like that's like totally useless. When the reality is like two teams are feuding about whether they're using like Kafka or Kinesis, and because they're feuding, like there's this like gap in this like bridge library that neither of them is willing to own. There's like always like a real story of what's happening, and it's never this like generic kind of like truism.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you think about like constructing a team, I know different leaders have, some people really like focusing on potential. Some people really like, all senior, this is how I like to compose it. Some people are more like, I like to think about the big picture, work backwards. Some people are more opportunistic. Do you have like your own rules of thumb for the different teams you've built?
So I think like my biggest one is like reason from like the boxes, not from the people. Like, and different people, to your exact point, go totally different directions on this one. But I've always seen like when you reason from the boxes, then you get people who are bought in to trying to do the right thing for like the greater good. When you reason from the people, you get like super weird outcomes. And it's a little bit like, and it gets like more perverse the longer you do it. Like the more you focus on the boxes, the more you get people who are willing to like shift their role a little bit to like kind of work together.
By the boxes, you mean like the work that needs to be done, or the skills, like checkbox?
Yeah, totally. So to me, like the boxes in this case are kind of the org chart. Like I need someone to run platform, I need someone to run data, and like one for each of these business units or something like that.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And is there anything you look for in a hire? Like, I know some people are like, I look for like drive, or I look for like execution, or, or for you, is it just consistency? I like really consistent people.
So at Uber, when I applied for the management job that I took there, like the number one requirement was grit, which I thought was kind of funny. It's like, this job's going to suck. You need to like have a lot of like reserve.
Grit's a good one.
But like it was funny because I think it accurately reflected the level of pain that was coming my way if I had thought a little bit more deeply about what was about to happen. So I actually appreciated that one. I don't have like any one characteristic. What are some things that I care about a lot? I think so. I'm primarily hiring like pretty senior leaders. So clear communication, the ability to like actually answer questions directly. The ability to like break down a complicated topic into a presentation and answer questions in a presentation. So to me, honestly, for really senior folks, forcing them to present about something real and take questions. Cause like, you've presented to like your board, you're presenting and then they like derail you and they derail you again. And then like some people, when they've been derailed 3 times by these like some of the questions are really, really good. And some of the questions are like so unhelpful, but you're trying to make them feel good about themselves for asking it.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to like take both of those. And some people, this is like a core exec skill to like manage that
like,
sort of situation.
Like communication, right? Like at the next level, like dynamic environment communication.
But clear thinking actually coming through, because some people just get so flustered that you can't get the thinking anymore. And some people are like so good at like, fantastic question. Here's how we've thought about it. And like, they can like turn a bad question into a good question.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as like the exec skill you'd want. Okay. Yeah. I like that. It's very clear. And what's a red flag across, you know, a lot of the hiring you've done? Like, what's one thing where you just flat out reject anyone?
I think people who are really specific about what they have to own. I think so. At a Calm, I did some hiring for like the head of data, and there was a question about whether it was a head of data engineering and data science and machine learning engineering, or just like a head of data science. Yeah. And some people come in and they're like, only open to this job if I have data engineering and machine learning engineering and data science. It has to be that way. And it's not that they're wrong to want that or not want that. It's just like the reality is like if you work at a company for 4 or 5 years, like your role is going to change a bunch. And if you're so like rigid on it, then you're going to keep feeling like you're getting screwed over whenever your role changes, when it's just like a natural part of kind of evolution. And you want people who are mature enough to kind of, you can be resentful. It's like, I can't believe they just took away data engineering from me or something. It's like, it's fine to be like a little bit resentful sometimes. These things like suck. Yeah. But who can't think of a way to like exist other than this perfect way? Like orgs just don't work that way. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So now let's talk about change and breaking changes. So you've been at Uber, Stripe, and Carta during some really dramatic times of growth and change. I'd love to dig into times you've had to lead your team through process additions or strategic pivots. So like, we'll start with maybe the hard one or easy one, depending on how you look at it. What's one thing that happened smoothly that, you know, there are lessons to be shared there? So, I mean, the biggest change that I ever led was working at Uber, where we rolled out kind of the move to self-service service provisioning. And so when I joined, every service was provisioned with basically like, you had to write like 8 Puppet files. You wrote them by hand. Then you had to like commit it, or get it reviewed, commit it. Then you had to run Puppet. Then once, and it would fail. Then you had to update this like meta-based kind of like, it's really old, like meta, like database for like console, but old. And then you had to update that correctly. Then you had to run Puppet again, and Puppet would be failing in between. Blah blah blah. It was just like this kind of many steps. People made mistakes all the time. Only a few people in engineering really knew how to do it. So you just got like a ton of friction. And like every day we had more service requests coming in than we could complete. So every day we woke up and we're like further behind than the day before. And we rolled out self-service provisioning, and it was, you know, a ton of work, but we got it to work. And by the time I left, like everything was self-service. There was no manual provisioning. And like we didn't break anything in the process of doing it. And we migrated data centers entirely while we were there in the midst of this. Wow. Like all sorts of stuff happened, and that succeeded. So that was the best one by far. Yeah.
What do you think was was behind the success? Was it just like really like good, careful thinking and old-fashioned hard work, or, you know, were there some insights into how to do this smoothly?
Definitely some insights and some hard work. And so I think the secret of failed migrations is if you do all the easy stuff, you can like get the migration percentage high, but like not actually solve the hard problems. Yep. And so you have to do like a few easy ones to get like the mechanics right. Like, is this easy? It make the easy case easy, but then you have to like do the hard ones, like the ones where it's not just like the easiest case, because that's where it's going to fail. Like you're not going to fail on doing like the 15th easy one. You're going to fail on like the first or second hard and complicated one. Yeah. So we got like, 10-ish of the easy ones just to prove out the concept. Yeah. Then we just did the hard ones. And it sucked. Like it was a ton of work. It was like not that fun. Like those teams weren't always like the easiest ones to work with because they were under a lot of pressure too.
So what made a migration hard? Like, did you know ahead of time, and was it because of the makeup of the team and their goals, or was it the technology, or a combination of the two?
So there's kind of like two different buckets. So like one of them was just like there's like the legacy monolith, and so there's just so much stuff built into it. There's so many
Yeah.
dependencies. They do so many things that aren't standard because they were implemented before the standards existed at all.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
like that was a hard one. Also, it was like by far the highest scale of all the services. So like had way more compute that needed to be rolled out. Also did the
Yeah.
most database work, etc. So that one was like by far the hardest.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other ones
That
though
makes
would be
sense.
like doing something unusual, like Uber had like a bit of a let builders build was a cultural value. And sometimes that meant like someone was rolling out like Elixir in like a Docker container. And even though no one knew like what Elixir was or like how to read an Erlang stack trace or anything. And so you just like run into like really like weird stuff people had done where they were just like, why did you do this?
Yeah.
And that would be the other case of just
Yeah.
like people just doing random stuff.
Yeah. And I can also see like it might be harder to corral them, because if they were doing random stuff in the first place, like why should they unrandomize their stuff now?
But that was like the beauty of Uber, where it was like, because let builders build cultural value and like infrastructure, we knew we couldn't tell them what to do. And so we built around that. We didn't try to think about, we're going to convince them to do it the right way. They didn't agree with us about the right way, and we couldn't force them to do it our way. So we're like, look, we're just going to make a system where they don't need to agree with us for it to work in a way that we can maintain.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay. A follow-up question or comment I have is that I feel like most migrations, I have this term that I made up called Zeno's migration, like after Zeno's paradox in math, where like you actually never approach zero, I guess it is, or because you're always like, slightly approaching it. It's like, I feel like a lot of migrations I see, they're like, we're like this much far away, because I think it's exactly this pattern that you do the easy stuff and then you stop. Like how did you get the buy-in to finish the migration?
We just went and did it. So a lot of the stuff we were able to automate the migration. A lot of the stuff we did it by hand.
Oh wow!
And we just for the long tail that we couldn't actually get to automate.
Yeah,
I think people like to turn problems into organizational problems, where it's like we can't get the other team to do it, so we're stuck. And this feels good because it's not your fault the other team won't do it, and then you like escalate.
Yeah.
But we just took the stance of like, this must get done.
Yeah.
We cannot maintain the existing cluster.
Yeah. No, I think
we'll do it
that
ourselves.
Something like that is necessary. Okay, yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. Well, next question is, what's one change that didn't go as well? And what are some lessons for folks there?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest direct lead off this one is when I went to Stripe, just out of Uber, went to Stripe, and I was like, had just succeeded this migration. And I was like, I know what Stripe needs. Like these tools don't even have like a self-service provisioning tool. Anyway, that didn't go very well. So it was sort of like, you get a hammer and everything's a nail. But I was just so like kind of like euphoric off this migration going so well.
Like I'm such a good migrator.
I'm like, I'm gonna show them what they're missing. They did not have a lot of excitement for it, and they, in this case, it's like the team I was leading, and so I was trying to build some interest and excitement from it. And some people were pretty interested. There's always like the cohort in your team that's like, Kubernetes is new technology, which it was, in 2016, and they're like, well, that sounds fun. But the senior engineers were just like, this is a terrible idea. And I was like, no, it's not. And I tried to convince them. And at one point I had this conversation with one of the engineers and was like, hey, what could I do to roll this out such that you thought this was safe? And he was like, there's no way you could make me think this was a safe decision. Nothing would make me comfortable with this. And like, ultimately, like I took like a 2-year break on trying to roll that out.
Yeah.
So we did get back to it in terms of like doing a move to Kubernetes, but it took a long time and to like make sure I understood why people hated the idea so much. And to me, this was like a leadership win, right? Where I think the biggest challenge I see is like for engineering leaders, I call it like the grand migration. where you come into a company, and this was me like almost doing the wrong thing. Like, okay, I know what's wrong with Stripe. They don't have Kubernetes, which is like, whatever was wrong with Stripe in 2016, Stripe's problem was not that they did not have Kubernetes, right? Like, I can like promise you that was like absolutely not like their customers were calling up upset because like there was no Kubernetes powering Stripe. 100% wrong. Like my read was just like quite bad. I think where I got fortunate, or maybe had like some perspective, is I didn't like try to push it through, because I certainly could have rammed it through, but it wouldn't have actually worked because it just wasn't solving a problem that we actually had at that moment. And so, yeah, I see a ton of people do that. And it's definitely where I see leaders get in the most trouble, is like the magic thinking about this big migration they'll lead when, 6 months after they start.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I think it's good to recognize, well, how did you recognize that this was not the path to go down?
So usually, like, you go do this like kind of like consensus building exercise, where you go talk to like all the key people and you get them excited. Some of them I could get excited, and some of them I just couldn't get excited at all. And that's like relatively uncommon. Like I usually can get consensus built around something, because usually people at some point give up. They're like, all right, well, like I'm tired of talking to you about this. So if you like really want to do it, like go try. I just like couldn't get them there. And so instead of just like forcing it, I was like, I must be missing something. I'm not going to push it this time.
Okay. No, this makes sense. All right, cool. So next question, less fun question, is some changes like reductions in force are never fun and, just are really hard to do smoothly. Do you have lessons from doing things like that might be helpful for other leaders?
So it's been interesting. So I did my first reduction in force in, I guess, I don't know, like 2013, maybe at Dig. And so Dig went through a series. I think Dig was a high flying company at one point, and then ran into some pretty significant friction with like Google SEO changes, where the traffic jumped, had one profitable month, and then really started coming down as they made more and more SEO changes over time at Google. And we just never recovered. Then we also did some other stuff that didn't go super well. Like we launched like a pretty bad migration to Dig v4, which was not super well received. But really, we're kind of already sinking pretty badly by that point. So I think that's a moment that people point to as if it was the thing that killed Dig. But the thing that killed Dig was like SEO changes for a company that was wholly dependent on SEO for driving revenue. And so that was the first one. And that one, I mean, I don't know, it was like 2023 or 24 or something at the time. And that was like a pretty like eye-opening one, where I think was just moved into a management role, making decisions on who would stay and leave, and like did not feel qualified to make it.
For a new manager,
And the only manager left on engineering at that point, because everyone who wasn't a complete idiot had quit, other than me. On the management side, lots of really talented engineers still there, just the managers. But anyway, that was a rough one. And I think something I learned there is there's no like easy or good decisions. And so I think it's just going to be rough. That's really what I appreciated then. But the beauty, if you will, of like 2014 is like layoffs are pretty infrequent, and they usually happen like once. I think that the challenge of like 2023 and 2024 is it's like pretty different. There's like quite a few layoffs happening across the industry. People who are like running into one, then like joining another company and running to another. I think particularly people in like technical recruiting, et cetera. Really, really challenging market. And I think for me, like the things that I've learned is like one, I think if you try hard enough, often you can find roles for more people than you think, by pushing the details like hard and long enough, trying to find like the different teams, different opportunities, like stretching a little bit. And I think there's like an interesting tension between what is theoretically optimal in terms of like, oh, it's like not a front-end engineer and that's what we really need, so we shouldn't retain someone. But then like, what's the right thing to do in terms of like trying to honor the team that you've hired and these people you've been working with, and being willing to stretch a little bit. And I think, part of the job and leadership is like eating the pain of the stretching, where I do think we have like a pretty meaningful obligation to try to make things work, even when it's not like kind of theoretically ideal.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one of the lessons I've been learning is like being willing to take on more pain, trying to make it work. And the other one, the flip side, is that you do all of that to make it go as well as it can. And like no one will ever notice or appreciate that work. And so there's like interesting like kind of irony to it is that there's, I think, a lot of work that's unappreciated there, which I'm not saying people should appreciate executives. I think executives get a lot of good things and executives get some bad things. But I do think this has been an interesting moment as an executive thinking about all the work that is done that is like imperceivable. And really important despite the fact, and really worth doing despite the fact that no one will ever recognize it's been done.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Because I think that what people are focused on is the people who are upset and the people who are hurt, and
And and they're the right people to be focused on, right? Like those are the people who deserve the focus to be centered.
And also, you can't message. It could have been a lot worse, guys. Like, that'd be terrible.
I think one thing executives misunderstand is they think that there's ever going to be sympathy for like how hard your job is, but like no one gives a shit about how hard your job is, and that's just like not what you should expect as an executive. That's not real. Well,
and I feel like also no one's like, good job, you laid off like this many people instead of this many because of all the hours you put in, like figuring out.
For sure. It's, I mean, you were a CEO, so like, you know, the experience where like you got your team got acquired and you must have done an incredible amount of work, but so much of that work's like invisible, right? And so you can never let people know.
That's true. And I feel like also, like the feeling I get is the team's like, now we have to be somewhere else. Thanks a lot. But
and they're not wrong, right? Like they're right. Like there's nothing you can say that doesn't make what they're saying true. Like it is true. It is unfortunate. And it's also true that you probably put in, thousands of hours to make this the best possible thing out there. And so it is like this interesting kind of tension there between the work that's valuable and the work that's perceived as valuable in some of these cases.
Yeah, I often tell my CEO now that I'm really glad that his job is to have everyone be mad at him, because I feel like the higher up you are, the more people, it's like your job to just absorb like the upsetness of more people and like do more like, as you call it, imperceivable work.
Yeah, when I left Yahoo, the senior director, someone like came and like had an exit chat with me. He's like, well, all I do is like deal with conflict. If anything's going right, like I never get involved. So I don't think that's quite true, but like in some cases, it's definitely true. I think that's a really good answer, and I think a lot of people are kind of going through some of the hard parts of navigating that right now, so they'll appreciate that. All right, so now let's talk more about just leading through the growth stage, more fun. In your experience, what hurts the most during growth? Or probably the answer is also it depends, but I think it's good starting point for talking about some things. So I think there's like two different types of growth that like in good growth companies happen at the same time. And there's kind of like the usage of the products growing, where like the loads on your database, the loads on your servers are like doubling or whatnot every like six months. And there's like the org is growing a lot. And what you do for these two different things is like pretty different. But I do think Uber was like a great education for me, because like Uber, the traffic load on our web servers was like doubling every 6 months. And headcount was doubling in engineering every 6 months. Actually, the entire company was doubling. So I joined 2014, and it was like 200 engineers. I left 2 years later, it was like 2,000 engineers.
Yeah, wow.
And traffic grew kind of comparably as well. And so just like every year we had to rewrite core systems because they just weren't designed for the scale that they were operating on. And so that was like pretty extreme example of it. But also like the org structures kept breaking, because you can't train internal managers quickly enough to deal with like teams that are blowing up from like 20 to like 160 in like 12 months. You just can't learn how to do management that quickly. It's too hard.
Yeah.
So I mean, tons of problems, but I think if I were to like say maybe the most interesting one is like, how do you think about bringing in senior experienced folks versus how do you think about nurturing your team? And this is relevant both to the scalability of the org and the product, right? Because I think you bring in senior folks. And at the time, like when you interviewed people at Salesforce, like how do you scale things? They're like, oh, you just add like another rack to your Oracle cluster.
Yeah.
And so you have like folks who have like this like experience where you just like add like more like database racks to your clusters. And you have folks from like Facebook or Google who have like radically different kind of scaling methodologies and how they like did things internally. And pulling these folks in with these like really, really smart people who've been scaling Uber, but on like a startup stack of like increasingly large MySQL servers or something like that. Like, how do you do that? How do you get them to actually like collaborate successfully when they have such radically different like baselines of truth? And then, the org scaling stuff also, like, how do you bring in folks and incorporate them into this melting pot of just like many different management styles and values? I think incorporation of people and people's approach to technology and people's approach to management rapidly was kind of the core challenge across all of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about a different kind of growth, which is growth in leaders themselves, which I think is a related question. So I know you run a lot of learning groups. Maybe it comes out of having had to grow lots of different leaders over the course of your time at these high growth companies. But what do you think is the biggest set of skills that engineering leaders need to be honing? And like back into the context of this like high growth situation, in a high growth situation, like what's the best thing a leader can do to keep up with the pace of growth of their company?
Yeah, I mean, hard lesson, but I think in really fast growing environments, like the most valuable thing you can learn to do is like give up responsibilities when you're struggling.
Yeah.
Which is really hard, really, really hard to do. And honestly, like part of the reason why like Uber wasn't the right place for me long term is I really didn't want to like decrease my scope. But I was like struggling a little bit as I grew pretty rapidly in the size of the team I was working with. And I think having the like the self-awareness and the lack of ego to actually like tolerate that and like lean into that, because it's related. Something I've come to appreciate at fast growing companies, often the most interesting work happens in like the leaf nodes. I think, or at like the root node where the execs are.
Yeah.
A lot of the middle management work in between them sucks. And so it's just like it's not good. It's like not fun. It's hard. It's really hard. It's difficult, but it's like not fun. And so this is something it took me until I was at Stripe to actually appreciate is like actually like in these fast growing companies, earlier in your career, like the way you get stretched and developed is like doing deep, valuable work in the leaf nodes. Not by like climbing the ladder in the middle management. The management culture at these fast growth companies isn't very good. Like because they're like brand new and they're growing too quickly. So it's like usually like almost like the worst place you can go to learn to be a good manager. But the actual work at the leaf nodes is like incredibly valuable at those growth companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have advice for people to figure out how to be self-aware that, they're struggling with parts of their job or, there's parts that they're not just going to grow into the next week?
So, some people respect lessons from other people and those people are wonderful. Like I love them. Personally, I just had to like fuck up kind of at each step to like really understand it. So I'm a very self-taught sort of person where I go like struggle with things and then figure it out. But if I don't struggle with it, I don't quite get it myself. And so that's a limitation. The thing I found that accelerates this for me is like writing. We're just trying to like articulate like the problem and like how I'm approaching it. That's like really sped up my rate of learning. So I think that's been for me really valuable.
Yeah.
But I don't recommend being this way. Like I would recommend learning from other people.
Yeah.
But the problem with like advice is it's really good advice is so context specific and like people don't really know your context. So it's hard to know when to learn from other people.
Yeah. Do you have, or I guess you have advice about like signs that you're struggling? Because I feel like often, unless someone's getting like very good feedback from, a boss or a mentor, which doesn't always happen in these kinds of environments, it's hard to understand like that you're struggling until it's too late, if that makes sense. So like, do you have advice for like, how do you figure out if like, you've gone too far for your abilities, or, when is the right time just to get a coach or a mentor versus like step back and scale back?
So, I mean, the biggest indicator that someone's like failing is like being able to point out like the flaws in everyone around them. And so like in the learning circle we're in, like Uma Chingande has this idea of like a Kaufman's triangle, or the drama triangle.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of like the hero, the villain, and the victim. And I find like people who are struggling have like used this device a lot, and they're either the hero, where it's Jean's trying to roll out a return to office policy, and that's wrong. She's victimizing everyone, but I'm gonna like stop Jean from rolling this out. And you're like, that's like gives you a lot of like importance. You get a lot of self-worth, but it's probably not like a way to frame the problem where you can ever make progress on it, because I've like framed you as like the villain, and like how am I supposed to come to terms with you in a way where we can like negotiate if I've like framed you as a villain? Like it's sort of impossible. And so a lot of the people that I've worked with that have gotten stuck get to a certain point, and then like everything, they're like the villain, the victim, or the hero. But this is like a breakdown in relationships.
Yeah.
It's like when I work with like the product leaders that I've worked with, it's like if I ever am like, well, product wants to do this, like those dummies, it's like I'm never going to succeed at that moment, because I've already started framing it in this like very like unsophisticated way. And so to me, that's like the biggest indicator, is like when you're focused on like the villains around you, or how you're going to like, our CEO is doing something so bad, and like we're going to stop him by doing this. This isn't like how real problems get solved. Every CEO and every chief product officer and every CTO is doing something that makes a lot of sense in their context. You have to go like try to unpack that. And if you can't see them beyond these like simplified roles, then like you yourself are like failing.
No, that makes sense. Okay, cool. And last question before we move on to our closing questions. Well, was being CTO always part of your goal, or was it something you happened upon as you continue to stretch yourself?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I had any goals growing up. No, no real career goals until I got into the tech industry. Teaching English is not like a career inspiring. I knew I didn't want to be teaching English. That was a clear goal for me. But no, I didn't have any goals. But as I got into it, I think the most core thing for me is I like solving problems. And I'm very like, obsessed with the fire. And so wherever the fire is, like I can't, even if I know I should ignore it, I just can't look away from where the fire is. I want to go there and try to put it out. And so I think for me, like increasingly believe like the most interesting fires at most companies are like on the people side, the management side, the strategy side. You only get access to these problems and like increasingly senior like people leadership roles. And this is like, I think, an industry problem. And like one of the things I've been trying to figure out, both with writing Staff Engineer, but also with like at Carta, we rolled out this idea of navigators, where we have like really senior engineers who are given the context to give senior managers. So they're not just like missing the context they need to think about how to solve hard problems. They actually understand why we're doing like this strategy, or et cetera. We should leverage these folks better than we do. But at most companies, like those things don't exist. And the only way to get access to the context and the problems before the company's decided what to do and it's too late to actually solve them is getting into people leadership. And so that's where I kind of got drawn over time.
Okay. I think that's a great answer. And actually on this podcast this season, we tried to select a mix of people on the people leadership track and the senior IC track to, dig into this question a little bit too, which is one of the reasons I asked. Okay, cool. So closing questions. They're a little rapid fire. First, what's the most underrated breaking change in the industry right now?
What is a breaking change?
You define it. What's something that's going to change how the industry works, break stuff? And for this question, underrated.
Okay, most underrated breaking change is I think the way that venture is working right now. There's less money coming into funding venture funds. And so companies of the next generation are going to be a lot smaller and they're going to force to do things where they're profitable
and scarcity.
earlier.
Yeah. Do you think we've rolled back beyond like 2015, like pre-2015, or do you think it's even more scarce than that?
So I think that there's more access to capital in early stages than there was in 2015, but I think there's less access to capital in later stages than in 2015. So I think we've gone
definitely
way back.
A different dynamic. Because I feel like I talked to founders who started their company like pre-2012, and they'll say, "Oh, we had it was an easier time for us." And I think on the one hand, it was easier because there was less competition, but on the other hand, there was less competition because it was so freaking hard back then to get, the network, the capital, anything. So I do think the shape of venture has really dramatically changed. Cool. That is underrated. Okay. All right. Next question. I have to ask, what's your hot take on the breaking changes that AI will introduce?
So one of the interesting things is you look back and again, venture, you had the mobile change. So tons of new companies came out building around mobile. And then that kind of change has exhausted itself. So Web 2.0, then mobile, they're both exhausted. And now investors are looking for places to put money on what's the next wave. So crypto, I think, has not proven itself out to be the next wave. It seems like that wave's kind of coming to an end pretty small. Still interesting stuff happening there, but much smaller kind of scope than it was a couple years ago. AI, my personal theory is that AI is going to get swallowed by the cloud providers. They have the compute. People already have contracts there. The biggest challenges for adopting AI today are one, negotiating the contract, but then two, negotiating the enterprise components of who owns the data, what sort of retention of the data are you doing, et cetera. You already have all of that worked out with your cloud provider. The cloud providers are the place where they have the computation. Getting improved models is getting easier and easier. It's not clear that anyone's truly differentiated with the models, beyond a given 6-month window. One will be better than the other, but 6 months later, the others have caught up.
Okay, interesting. So your answer is that win. Actually things won't break because the cloud providers will just continue to provide your AI, and then everyone will just use AI.
So where does the value accumulate for these different pieces? So my take is that the value accumulates in two places, right? Applications will have interesting AI powered functionality. I think it'll be a little bit less than the venture ecosystem wants it to be. It's not going to transform everything, but there's certain use cases. I think for Carta, document extraction, document management, there's a lot of value and applicability of kind of LLMs there. Then the question is how much of the rest of the value goes to providers, model trainers, and kind of tooling versus the compute, NVIDIA on the GPUs and the cloud providers as the server kind of hosts.
Yeah.
I don't think the middle layer is going to actually take that much value long term is my personal belief.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. What change, personal or professional, are you excited about this year that you're willing to share? And also keep in mind your episode's not coming out until May or June. So if the change already happened by then, I guess we have to talk about it in the right tense.
Yeah, so probably the biggest change for me will be my third book coming out in March. And so has been fun working on that one. And most fun is that means I get to figure out what my next project is once that one is kind of fully done.
Do you want to plug it? Because it will have come out. People can buy it.
Yeah. So, and if you wanted to buy a copy, it's the Engineering Executives Primer from O'Reilly. Buy it Amazon, buy it O'Reilly, anywhere you want. And I think meant to be a book for certainly engineering executives, but also for anyone who's trying to figure out why their engineering executive keeps doing things that don't make sense. This could be your decoder ring for them.
Cool. Yeah, we get a book benefit at Postman, so I'll make everyone buy this book. Cool. So for people who want to hear more from you, where can they find you? What should they read in addition to Engineer Executive Handbook?
Yeah, so I mean, my 3 books are the best starting place. So, Engineering Executives Primer, the Staff Engineer, and then An Elegant Puzzle. Kind of, I think, good kind of summary of that. My thinking and writing over the last, like 5 or 6 years. And certainly, always writing kind of weird stuff on my blog, Irrational Exuberance.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, Will. Yeah. All right.
You.
Yeah. This was really fun. Hope other people got as much out of this as I did.